So, new information has come out about these mysterious or unusual, I should say, IgG4 antibodies that have been observed in vaccinated individuals. And let's find out what we could learn from this new information that came out. My name is Dr. Mikola Rashek of Mirror Genomics. And before we get started, I just want to remind you we have another COVID Q&A event coming up. So check it out. Information is in the description below. And we're also running a couple of surveys, including a survey on, hey, what kind of supplements might have helped you with your COVID-19 experience. So check it out as well. That survey is in the description below as well. So 2 papers came out since the last video I made on these IgG4 antibodies. One of them is a review. That review still has not been peer reviewed. It's a preprint, but because it's a review, I think it's totally okay to start discussing it. Basically, the authors themselves reviewed the information that has been published so far on these IgG4 antibodies in vaccinated individuals and as well as other historical information, and come to their own conclusion. So let's start with the conclusion first, people. Some of you have asked, hey, why don't I start with a summary? Because some of the information, the way I present, can be complicated. And the summary is as follows. These IgG4 subclass of antibodies lead to tolerance, which is potentially not a desirable effect, because the likely outcome from this will be the fact that people who have these antibodies might experience unopposed reinfections with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Okay, now let's start unpacking all of that information. First, let's talk about what is the prevalence of these antibodies. So these IgG4 antibodies, because of their role, biological role, they're the least common antibodies that in our body, and typically the amount will be somewhere between 0.35 to 0.5 milligrams per milliliter of blood. Now, in comparison to the most prevalent antibody, which would be IgG1, that antibody is found in levels somewhere between 5 to 12 milligrams per milliliter of blood. So somewhere between 10 to 35 times higher levels of this antibody of IgG1 in comparison to IgG4. So that's how prevalent they are. This antibody is unusual. It's uncharacteristic. And why is that? Is because it does not stimulate the effector functions of the effector immune cells. So what does that mean? Effector immune cells are the type of immune cells that basically clean up the complexes of antibodies bound to the virus. So why do we need antibodies? Antibodies, we want it to bind to the pathogen, and then we have immune cells that obviously deal with that. So these cells that deal with that are called effector cells, and the type of activities they perform is called, well, I guess, effector functions or effector actions. So what I mean by that, we discussed this before. One example is antibody dependent cell cytotoxicity. That's basically where an immune cell, such as natural killer cell, will recognize the complex and will kill the cell that is exposed to the virus. Another example is antibody dependent cell phagocytosis, and that in that example, basically the complex of the virus and antibodies is literally swallowed up by the immune cells. That's where macrophages, for example, come into the play. And then there's also cell-dependent complement system as well. All of these are effector functions that basically ensure that the pathogen, the virus, is cleaned out of our system. Okay. Now, IgG4 do not stimulate these. So that's basically what makes them highly unusual. And there's consequences, obviously, for that, because that means this antibody does not promote clearance of something like a pathogen. Another unusual thing about these IgG4 antibodies is that, remember, antibodies, they look like a Y-shaped letter, right? Basically, those are two molecules bound together that form the Y. So one, you can, if you were to cut that Y in half, you'd have your two elements, and they're bound together through chemical bonds. These chemical bonds, those are disulfide bridges, the same chemical bonds that are believed that N-acetylcysteine could be destroying in its activity when it might be destroying the spike protein. We made a video on that as well. Now, IgG4 antibodies, they can split in half, unlike other antibodies, and they can recombine. So one type of IgG against one antigen can bind to another half of IgG that recognizes completely different antigen. So whereas your typical antibodies at the tips of that letter Y, they're recognizing same antigen. So an example would be that antibody at both tips of the letter Y would be recognizing spike protein. IgG4 could be recognizing spike protein on one tip and something else on another tip. What that means is that IgG4 antibodies are not as likely to build large immune complexes, and that also can reduce the ability to clear the system. So as a consequence of this, IgG4 antibodies can be both protective as well as pathogenic. So how are they protective? Why do we even have something like this? So recall in the previous video, I was mentioning that IgG4 antibodies can be protective against allergens. And the reason why is because what they will do is they can compete against other antibodies that will actually stimulate allergic reactions. So they can compete with IgE antibodies that are the ones that can lead to allergic reaction. So pollen is a good example, and as a consequence, they will, because they don't have these, they don't induce these effector functions. There also means that cells are not being destroyed, and the entire system is not inflammatory. So it's a good way to ensure that you don't pay heavy price for something that you are frequently exposed to, but might have allergic reaction to. So that's where they might be protective. But where they're pathogenic is, well, that's again when because they do not induce those effector functions of the immune system, immune cells, then they can lead to an issue. So let me give you an example. Approximately, according to the authors of this review I'm talking about right now, they mentioned that at least 13 autoimmune diseases, they are in existence because of this IgG4 antibodies. And some of these autoimmune diseases, the higher amount you have of these IgG4 antibodies, the more severe the autoimmune disease is. And another example is with cancer. And this is really interesting because it looks like certain cancers can stimulate the production of IgG4 antibodies in order to dodge the immune system. So it's a form of cancer immune escape. So that's how the cancer might actually escape the immune system recognition by the immune system, because the cancer cells can present the certain antigen, basically fool our immune system to start switching our IgG1 antibodies that are very effective against killing cancer cells into start producing IgG4 antibodies. And suddenly these IgG4 antibodies can start competing with IgG1 antibodies for cancer recognition. So they can prevent cancer cell clearance, because, for example, one, they can actually interact with receptors on the immune cells that are supposed to recognize the stock of antibodies. They remember the stock we talked about a few times, it's called Fc, and the receptors are called Fc receptors, and that's how immune cells grab the antibodies. It's by the stalk, the bottom half of the antibody, not where you have the letter Y, but the bottom stalk. And IgG4 antibodies can block these receptors and prevent them from being able to interact with the IgG1 antibodies that we want to be clearing the cancer cells. And another way to do it, and remember, they don't induce those effector functions, so there is no cytotoxic clearance, there is no phagocytic clearance, and another way that IgG4 antibodies can interfere is that apparently they can interact with IgG1 antibodies by binding to their own stalks. So stalks will interact with the stalks of IgG1, and as a consequence, IgG1 cannot now interact with those immune cell receptors as well. So here's how cancer cells can now avoid immune system and grow unimpeded. So that basically, we know that from past studies that the higher the levels a cancer patient might have of IgG4, the more likely that the cancer will be malignant and the poorer the prognosis of such individual. So here's a couple examples how this might be, how IgG4 antibodies can also be potentially pathogenic. All right, so then the authors of this review also, of course, reviewed the two papers that came out. I already made video on one of them. Since that video I made, another very interesting publication came out. And so let's talk about it. The authors of the review talked about it. So let's break that one down as well. Very interesting. So basically, it enhances our knowledge of what these IgG4 antibodies are doing in vaccinated individuals. So once again, like in previous studies, it turns out that it is the mRNA vaccines that are the ones that are stimulating the production of these IgG4 antibodies, and in this case, unlike the first publication I discussed in a previous video, these authors tested both the Moderna and Pfizer. And what turns out is that those individuals who haven't been infected, so they were immunologically naive and got the mRNA vaccines over time, eventually they started producing IgG4 antibodies, and those who had the Moderna vaccine were more likely to produce these IgG4 antibodies. And the authors stipulated that it might be because the Moderna vaccine used higher amount of the mRNA. So recall that the Pfizer mRNA gene therapy or injection used 30 micrograms of the mRNA versus Moderna gene therapy used 100 micrograms of mRNA per injection. And that might explain potentially why Moderna is more likely to induce more IgG4 antibodies than the Pfizer one. And once again, these authors showed that those who took the adenoviral vaccine, in this case they studied AstraZeneca vaccine, they did not produce these IgG4 antibodies. So this once again shows that this is mRNA vaccine related complication. But if an individual those were individuals who took 2 adenoviral injections, but those who took 1 adenoviral shot followed by mRNA injection, once again, they also were able to build IgG4 antibodies. But the coolest, most interesting finding of those authors was that those individuals who were naturally infected first, so they got COVID-19, or it's basically they got infected with SARS-CoV-2 virus, and then they were vaccinated with mRNA vaccines, they did not produce these IgG4 antibodies. So basically, natural infection was able to protect these individuals from subsequent production of these IgG4 antibodies. So super interesting, because based on all the information currently coming out about mRNA vaccinated individuals, if you were naturally infected and then you took the gene therapy injections, then you're fine against IgG4 antibodies. But those who took the shot and they were subsequently boosted or naturally infected, they were still more prone to produce IgG4 antibodies. So the natural infection first is basically what will save the individual from decreasing the likelihood of being able to produce these unusual antibodies. Now, the authors of the review did not discuss this, but the authors of that second paper on mRNA vaccines also looked at sugar structures on the antibodies. So recall I discussed this a long time ago in one of my videos, that you can have sugar structures on antibodies, and depending what these sugar structures are, the antibodies will have different outcomes in terms of their likelihood to protect you from severity of the disease. So what the authors were able to show, that those who were pre-infected first with the virus and then took the mRNA vaccination, or those who had 2 injections of AstraZeneca, they were more likely to have bifurcation of their sugar chains, meaning the sugar tower that is being built on top of their antibody, it is split in half, and then you, from one tower, you go to like 2 towers, if you will. It's like a tree branch. And they were also more likely to be glycosylated. And prior studies, then those who were just mRNA injected without prior infection, and prior studies have shown that this higher level of glycosylation resulted in greater protection from hospitalization if a person was infected with the virus. So there's dual effect here. Not only those who took the mRNA injection are more likely, without having prior infection, are more likely to produce IgG4 antibodies, they are also more likely to have less favorable sugar composition on the IgG1 antibodies, the ones that we actually want for protection as well. So I just wanted to toss that in. So the final conclusion of the authors of the review is that we should not actually be thinking that maybe these IgG4 antibodies are protective in a similar fashion as the IgG4 antibodies protect against allergens, which is what the authors of the first publications I discussed in a previous video suggested. Rather, they're saying that it's more likely that this is a pathogenic event, and more likely it is going to lead to tolerance against this pathogen, i.e. the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is likely to increase the reinfection of these individuals by the virus, and it's a form of immunodeficiency. And in fact, the authors even mention in the paper that perhaps the higher level of excess deaths that we have been observing in the last couple of years, and recall I've made a video on that topic as well, might be because of that. This could be one of the contributing factors. Remember, I was mentioning that there's probably many different contributing factors as to why we're seeing these excess deaths, and perhaps the increased production of these unfavorable antibodies long term, because they were not visible at the beginning post injection. They only started showing up later on. That might actually be one of the contributing factors to these excess deaths that we are observing. What I didn't like about this review is that it didn't mention anything how we could be protecting ourselves from this. Obviously, many of us could have increased levels of these IgG4 antibodies because large portion of every population has been vaccinated, and mRNA vaccines were the most commonly used injections, right? So how do we protect from that? And they didn't mention anything there. It was just mentioned in passing. So they mentioned two things based on some of the other studies they were recalling. They were mentioning that taking the blood and clearing out IgG4 out of the blood happened to restore the normal immunological protection. Now, but however, I don't know whether that even exists as a possible treatment for humans or not. Might have to study that in the future. And another way, though, remember I mentioned that IgG4 antibodies are linked to certain autoimmune diseases. So there's IgG4 related diseases, and in such situations, therapy with steroids happens to be helpful to such individuals. So those are just mentioned in passing. So what that means is that perhaps individuals who took the mRNA gene therapy and they know for sure they were not infected prior, they might consider checking their IgG4 antibodies and talking to a doctor about this. These tests are available privately. I'm not sure whether a doctor would offer such a test or not, but it's worth asking. It's definitely worth investigating. And if indeed there are higher levels of IgG4 antibodies, perhaps then a doctor could come up with a proper strategy or referral to a specialist that could help dealing with this issue, so that this doesn't lead to some unwanted or unnecessary complications later in the future. We got to protect ourselves somehow. We got to take care of these things. These are unintended consequences that always can arise, because remember, these injections, they were never studied for long term. We just simply took it in order to deal as rapidly as we possibly could with health emergency. And we knew that there is no long-term studies, and so it's not unusual that there might be some unintended consequences, but that doesn't mean we should not be dealing with this and make sure that everyone is fine. So another thing that the authors mentioned that I thought was interesting is, of course, because if this production of IgG4 antibodies happens in those who are taking mRNA gene therapy injections, and we know from past studies that they were talking about that repeated boosting and with vaccines for HIV or malaria, what such attempt resulted in actually reduced the likelihood of protection from infection, and actually also increase IgG4 level antibodies in such individuals. So we have a precedent as well in other forms of such studies with vaccines. The question is, should we be asking to have the individuals that are most prone to suffer from COVID-19, such as the elderly, or those who have diabetes or hypertension, or those who are immunocompromised, such as HIV patients, whether we should be asking them to continue boosting? Maybe we should rethink that strategy. So the authors of this review mentioned that as well. Is this appropriate course of action? Maybe we should be re-looking at this more carefully. That's all I have for you today. Hope you like this content, and if you do, please give us a like. Please subscribe to our channel. Please leave a comment, and let us know if you come up with other great information related to IgG4 antibodies or not, or if you looked at your own IgG4 antibodies as well. And of course, I wish all of you to have these IgG4 antibody levels as low as possible, right? And remember the COVID Q&A event, and if you want to attend the event for free, subscribe to our newsletter, and then we'll send you a free ticket. And I look forward to seeing you in the next installment. And remember, in the meantime, stay healthy and have fun outdoors. Bye, everyone.